Officer Johnson saw the car before he saw the driver. It was a routine patrol on a quiet evening, the kind of night where nothing much happens. But Johnson knew better than to let his guard down. He had been on the force long enough to know that trouble often lurked in the most mundane situations. An old beat-up sedan, probably blasting that rap music. He flipped on his lights. The car's condition told a story of its own. Years of wear and tear, a life lived hard. Johnson had seen it all before. He knew the type of people who drove these kinds of cars, or at least he thought he did. The car pulled over, slow and respectful. Good. Johnson appreciated compliance. It made his job easier and safer. He approached the vehicle cautiously, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, just in case. You could never be too careful.
License and registration. The words came out automatically, a script he had recited countless times before. But each time there was a different face, a different story.
Johnson approached the driver's side, his senses heightened. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, a familiar rush that came with the territory, already feeling the familiar itch of suspicion. The driver was a young black man, athletic build. He had a calm face, almost too calm, Johnson thought. It was the kind of calm that made him uneasy. Athletic build. He had a calm face, almost bored. The man complied, his movements measured. Johnson took the documents, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. He had learned to read people, to look for the little signs that something was off. Almost bored. The man complied, his movements measured. Johnson took the documents, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. He had learned to read people, to look for the little signs that something was off. His movements measured. Johnson took the documents, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. He had learned to read people, to look for the little signs that something was off. The driver's calm demeanor was unsettling, but Johnson couldn't put his finger on why. His eyes scanning for anything out of place. The documents seemed in order, but Johnson knew better than to take things at face value. He had been fooled before.
You know why I pulled you over? The question was rhetorical, a way to gauge the driver's reaction. Johnson watched closely, looking for any signs of nervousness or deceit.
Johnson asked, already knowing the answer. The driver shook his head slowly. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Johnson could feel the tension in the air, a silent standoff between two men who didn't know each other but were bound by the circumstances of the night. Already knowing the answer, the driver shook his head slowly. Johnson could see the resignation in his eyes, a look he had seen many times before. It was the look of someone who knew the drill, who had been through this routine more times than they cared to remember.
Didn't make a complete stop back there. The words were almost an afterthought, a formality. Johnson knew that the real reason for the stop was something deeper, something unspoken.
Johnson said, his tone accusing. The driver remained silent, his eyes fixed on Johnson. It was a stare that held 1,000 unspoken words, a silent plea for understanding, for justice, his tone accusing. The driver remained silent, his eyes fixed on Johnson. It was a stare that held 1,000 unspoken words, a silent plea for understanding, for justice. Johnson felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it aside. He had a job to do. His eyes fixed on Johnson. The moment stretched on, a silent battle of wills. Johnson knew he had to make a decision, to either escalate the situation or let it go. He took a deep breath, weighing his options, knowing that whatever he chose would have consequences.
You know, this is a predominantly white neighborhood, right?
Johnson asked, watching the driver's reaction. The driver finally spoke, his voice deep and steady.
Yes, officer.
Johnson continued his scrutiny. Something about the driver's calmness unnerved him.
Where you headed in such a hurry?
Just going home from work, officer.
The driver replied, his gaze unwavering. Johnson examined the driver's attire. Simple jeans, a plain t-shirt, nothing remarkable. He handed back the documents.
Listen, I'm going to let you off with a warning this time, but next time be more careful, you hear?
The driver nodded, his expression unreadable. Johnson returned to his patrol car, the encounter leaving him with a strange mix of annoyance and unease. As Johnson drove away, he saw the driver's car pull into a driveway a few houses down. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and strangers stood out. Johnson couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as he watched the car disappear into the driveway. A well-maintained house with an American flag waving proudly. Interesting. The house stood out, not just because of its pristine condition, but because it seemed to exude a sense of pride and belonging. It was the kind of house that made a statement, one that Johnson couldn't ignore. Later that week, Johnson found himself patrolling the same neighborhood. The streets were lined with similar houses, each with its own story, its own secrets. Johnson's mind kept drifting back to that one house, the one with the flag. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He saw the driver again, this time mowing his lawn. Johnson couldn't resist stopping. The man seemed so at ease, so comfortable in his surroundings. It was almost as if he belonged there, but Johnson's instincts told him otherwise. He pulled up alongside the driver. The tension in the air was palpable. A silent standoff between two men who were both trying to assert their dominance.
Nice neighborhood for your kind. Johnson's words were laced with sarcasm and disdain, a thinly veiled insult that hung in the air like a dark cloud.
He said, a sneer creeping onto his face. The driver didn't flinch, his expression remaining calm and composed, almost as if he had expected this confrontation. The driver stopped mowing and turned, his expression still unreadable. There was a moment of silence, a brief pause before the storm.
What do you mean, officer? The driver's voice was calm, but there was an underlying challenge in his tone, a defiance that was hard to miss.
He asked, his voice calm. Johnson could feel his anger rising, the driver's calm demeanor only fueling his frustration.
You know what I mean. Johnson's voice was sharp, his words cutting through the air like a knife.
Johnson said, his tone laced with disdain. He couldn't understand how the driver could remain so calm, so composed in the face of such blatant hostility. The driver set down the lawnmower and stepped closer. There was a determination in his eyes, a resolve that Johnson couldn't ignore.
I live here, officer. I served my country. The driver's voice was firm, his words a declaration of his right to be there, a challenge to Johnson's authority.
He said, his voice firm. Johnson scoffed. He couldn't believe the audacity of the driver, the nerve to stand up to him.
Yeah, right, and I'm the president. Johnson's words were dripping with sarcasm, a final attempt to assert his dominance in a situation that was quickly slipping out of his control.
Here's my military ID, officer. I served my country with honor and dedication.
The driver reached into his wallet and pulled out a card, holding it out with a steady hand. The card was worn, a testament to the years of service it represented.
Navy SEAL? I didn't expect to see that.
Johnson hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly before he snatched the card. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the insignia caught his eye immediately. His eyes widened as he read the name and rank, his face draining of color. This was no ordinary man. This was a decorated hero.
3 tours in Afghanistan, officer. I've seen things most people can't even imagine.
The driver nodded slowly, his voice steady and calm, a stark contrast to the tension in the air. He had faced far worse than this. Johnson felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had jumped to conclusions, and now he was faced with the reality of his mistake. He looked at the driver, really looked at him, for the first time. This wasn't just some suspicious black man. This was a hero, a man who had risked his life for his country. The uniform was decorated with medals and insignias, each one telling a story of bravery and sacrifice. This man had earned his place in history.
I didn't know.
Johnson began, but the words caught in his throat. How could he apologize for such a grave misjudgment? The driver took back his ID, his expression softening slightly. He had seen this reaction before, and he knew how to handle it.
It's okay, officer. Not everyone understands. It's a tough world out there, and we all make mistakes.
Johnson felt a knot forming in his stomach. He had misjudged this man in the worst way possible, and now he had to live with that. He had misjudged this man in the worst way possible. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a heavy burden he would carry for a long time. As the driver walked away, Johnson couldn't help but reflect on his own biases. He had learned a valuable lesson today, one that he would never forget. The driver walked away with his head held high, a true embodiment of valor and dignity. He had faced adversity with grace, and in doing so, had taught Johnson a lesson in humility and respect. Johnson watched him go, a newfound respect blossoming in his heart. He vowed to never let his prejudices cloud his judgment again. This encounter had changed him, and he was determined to be better, to do better, for himself and for those he served. Johnson drove away, his mind racing. He had always considered himself a good cop, but what had he just done? He had let his prejudice cloud his judgment. He had treated a decorated veteran like a common criminal. The weight of his actions pressed down on him. He had to do better. He had to be better. The next day, Johnson went back to the driver's house. He wasn't sure why, maybe to apologize, maybe to try and understand.
Officer Johnson.
The driver said, acknowledging the unexpected visitor.
Can I talk to you?
Johnson asked, his voice subdued. The driver nodded and invited Johnson inside. They talked for a long time, about service, about sacrifice, about prejudice. Johnson listened more than he spoke. He learned about the driver's experiences, his fears, his hopes. He learned about the deep-seated pain that racism inflicted. As Johnson left that day, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had a lot to learn, a lot to unlearn, but he was determined to change. The encounter with the Navy SEAL was a turning point for Officer Johnson. He started seeing the world differently, treating everyone with respect, regardless of their race. He became an advocate for change within the police department, challenging his fellow officers to confront their own biases. It wasn't an easy journey. There were setbacks and resistance. But Johnson persevered, driven by the memory of his mistake and the hope for a more just and equitable future. He knew that change started with him, one interaction at a time, and he was determined to be a part of that change.